What's up, sluts? No one really knows for sure. Elevate, Dipre, Elohim. But this is the Missouri we live by. Sunday, 26, Sunday, May 17th. So it's Rosh Chodesh. Really, yeah. What is that? What's the first of the month? 3760 creation of the world, birth of Adam and Eve. 3631 137 of Adam was born. 3526 2 of Seth was born. 3436 35 son of Kenan was born. 3301 460 Yared, son of Allah, was born. 31. Birkat Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvot v'tzivanu al Sefirat HaOmer. Blessed be Hashem, our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us concerning the counting of the Omer. Today is 46 days, which is 6 weeks and 4 days of the Omer. May the merciful one restore unto us the service of the Beit HaMikdash speedily and speedily. No. May the merciful one restore unto us the service of the Beit HaMikdash to its place speedily in our days. Amen. Okay, cool. For how many days have we been doing this, bitch? Too many kids. 142. Don't tell him what I think.
On just how those ideas that we developing, and they're still now, and there have always been numerous mutually exclusive schools of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. This class is meant to serve as an introduction to mysticism and Kabbalah from the point of view of its incredibly complex development from the prophets of ancient Israel and to the rise of modern Hasidism in the 18th. Exhaustive by any means, but only should serve as a springboard and reflection, and hopefully it will also enable you to situate developments in Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah in their historical and cultural context, and hopefully embolden you attitude to congregation. For allowing me to use these lectures to reach a larger audience. Find playlist Entering Garden, an introduction to Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. I'll be uploading them over the next few weeks, or if you find these autumn of 2021 and want to watch the entire series, you can find them in that playlist. Series of Kabbalah interesting. I hope check out my other content on topics in esotericism. They're supporting the production of free academic and scholarly topics in occultism, hermetic philosophy by joining my Patreon or perhaps with a one-time donation. You can find those links below, and I really appreciate your consideration. Now, let's enter the garden of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. And what we got through in part one of this talk about the sacred Zohar, which again is One of the most intimidating books that I know of. People talk about how, in my opinion, trying to understand it. So as we went through last time, the Sefer Zohar, the Book of Radiance, is a mystical midrash. And midrashic literature is just a kind of literature that I sometimes describe as Jewish jazz. Not that there are Jewish jazz musicians, but it's sort of like medieval Jewish jazz at the literary level. It's where a person will take a piece of scripture and then riff on it. And then someone will riff on that riff, and someone will riff on that riff until you get something that's completely unrecognizable. But the idea is that if you adopt this riff and that riff came from, you can do a genealogy, the same way jazz musicians can do. Midrash works a lot like that in the Jewish literary world. And so what we have is a kind of mystical midrash, which is sometimes largely a commentary on very heavens of the earth, or translated. That verse gets dozens and dozens of pages right, and some other texts don't get much at all. So it's very uneven. It's composed of actually several different works combined together, and we talked about some of those minor works within the Zohar, which are self-contained units. Those self-contained units are very accessible. It's the Sava or the Yanuka, the sections are relatively accessible, relatively equal. Other sections like the Sifra Diuta, which is only 6 or so, Itapim, completely a mystery. It's one of the most difficult texts in all of Kabbalistic history. There have been dozens and dozens of commentaries written on it. It emerged in the 13th century in the Cirque world, in the Orthodox world. It gets its legitimacy because it's actually, according to them, traceable back to Shimon Bar Yochai, 2nd century sage. And what's important about that is on their way of telling the story, right? So the academic aggressive story is that it was composed in Spain, in the area of beginning around 12, a little after maybe. The traditional story, the Orthodox story, is actually composed by Shimon Bar Yochai in the 2nd century, and it was of the world in the 13th century. So that it was existed the entire time. It just had only been revealed to the world by in this circle. And some of the more difficult concepts to grasp, and one of those is Ein Sof. And this is God and God's most transcendent state, which is to say that you can't say anything about this conception of God. This is a conception of God that's completely transcendent. Nothing is true of it, and you can only talk about it in the negative. So this is a way that you can do philosophy with Kabbalah. Remember that in a big way, Kabbalah, the Zohar, is trying to answer a lot of the same kinds of questions that were relevant in medieval Europe at the time, logically and philosophically. One of those questions is, can a being beyond all adjectives, beyond all predicates, can we even possibly? And Maimonides famously said, no, all you can do is say, God isn't wise, because God is wise in a way that you can't understand. And so comparing your wisdom to God's wisdom is blasphemy, and therefore you must say that God is right. And so if God is infinitely non-ignorant, then we can infer from that logically that God is all-knowing. Something like that. So this being, Ein Sof, whatever it is beyond all understanding. Obviously in there, because if it ended there, we would not be here, right? Something must have created this world. And so that process, I wish, is through the Sefirot, the numerations. Again, how to translate this word is so difficult. That's basically, you just see that it's Latin in the Hebrew word, because we have a word. And so it's not that. That's the standard noun. You would derive from the root of Safar, but it's not. It's Sefirot. It's in the Kabbalist had up to 13. And these are transcendental emanations of the divine. Now, that's just a really complicated way of saying that these are parts of God that of Ein Sof. They flow out of that no-thingness, the vast emptiness of the Godhead, and they flow out, and there are discrete moments in the development of the Godhead, right? God is a process, not a thing. And so as these things develop, they're different than this one because of this, and that one's different than this one because of that. You can see how these things are different because they're different parts of the dynamic process by God comes into being. And one way of thinking about Kabbalah, all of Kabbalah, is to imagine the Kabbalah also the relationship of the Jewish people via Jewish law to the Sefirot. And we'll see that in a big way tonight. Because what's really important to grasp about the Sefirot in the Kabbalah, especially in the Sefer Zohar, is that there's absolutely no way of thinking without thinking about what Israel is and thinking about how Israel interacts with Jewish law, and that interaction with Jewish law is direct bearing on the metaphysical structure of reality. We're going to get to the idea of tikkun olam. That had nothing to do originally with giving to the poor. It had everything to do with you give to the poor because that act of tzedakah, of righteousness readjusts the dynamic state of affairs. So this is the two big ideas we covered last time. What is the Zohar? How was it composed? Who composed it? Looking at questions that until the early 20th century, the mid 20th century in many ways, we're still solving it. The original state of God is Ein Sof, without end or no thingness, and then the bridge that emerges out of Ein Sof that reaches down to our world in the form of the Sefirot. Last time, I can feel people like that ask questions I can't possibly. Why 10 and not 50? Because since they forget the
question. Ein Sof, some expression A-I-N, which sounds more like lion, or also E-I-N. It's probably just a variant, a difference in the two.
So you would think, and it's there's a complicated pun at work in Hebrew actually. So Ein Sof written with out, starting with two different means without end, infinite. It's a negation, but the word with an iron, right, means nothing. So it means the problem. I mean, different ways to spell Hanukkah in English. Well, a lot in the word Hanukkah. But there is a complex pun going on here too, right? So homophonically, it can sound like the nothingness, but also it can sound like without end. And so there'll be a lot of ideas about the idea of God as a kind of divine nothingness. Which for the Jewish Buddhists out there, the Jew Buddhists, Jewish Buddhism are.
So I guess I have a follow-up question, and I mean, we're not in 13th century Spain, so I just wonder about the pronunciation of Hebrew and Aramaic in an environment that was, neighboring times, people had Arabic-speaking neighbors, Syria. I'm wondering, distinguishing their pronunciation and the way, like, many Hebrew would, or if it's like, a lot of modern, we don't even hear the difference. So it's just a written difference. I don't know what was going on.
I have, to be, in terms of historical linguistics, I really have no idea. My sense of it is that Sephardic Hebrew, at least now, doesn't make a distinction. Now, I don't know when that distinction was lost. I mean, even in the talk about people who aren't making a distinction back then, pronouncing I am, and that's all the way back to the Talmud. So my guess is that Sephardi Jews, of whom Moshe de Leon wasn't making a distinction. But and it's interesting, right? Because the pun only works if you don't make a distinction. If you pronounce ayin and ayin as the same, and not ayin and because if you do pronounce those two consonants, and it's a different, one's a glottal stop and one's a voice pharyngeal fricative. If you do pronounce those differently, then the pun doesn't work. So my sense is because they like that pun, they were reading them identically, despite the fact that Hebrew could have been spoken like. And this also required knowing about how Rabbi Arabic was spoken. So that pun is possible to them, and no one criticizes the pun, then they must be pronouncing the two letters the same. That would require me to know things about Hebrew or Maghreb Arabic and etc. That definitely. Other questions before we jump into the Sphirot? Alright, folks, there it is. The image that I think most folks who have some knowledge of Kabbalah, who have heard the Kabbalah, have seen this image dozens of times. This is the classic image. If you Google Kabbalah, this is what's going to come up. And I put off putting it up because the reason why I put off putting it up is because I don't want you to get fixated. Because this is the image that has locked into people's mind that all the alignment that you see here on the screen right now is an ideal alignment. This never happened in our lifetime unless the Messiah comes. In the Zohar, they are very clear, the writers of the text are very clear, that this alignment is a perfectly balanced vision of what the Sphirot are. And it's very clear from the writer of the Zohar, it's an ideal representation, not as they ever have been, ever in all of history, but as they will be in the Messianic Hashem's one, right, when everything is unified. So is that this is what they don't like this in the Kabbalah, in the Zohar. They do not like this. Because if they did, our world would look very different. Because our world and the supernal world in the Zohar mirror each other. And if our world's out of whack, if anything has happened bad to you today, if anything's bad to happen to anything at all, then that means that the supernal world's also out of whack. Which means that these relationships are not in relationship. So the thing that I just want to, again, I want to pound this drum. The thing I want to pound about this drum is that this is an ideal representation of the Sphirot, not how they are. They're always in an inner dynamic relationship with God Himself, and all the various people, entities within God's self are always out. So what is it that's out? Let's go through them quickly, right? The first Sphirot, right? You see how this is open at the top? Because that's open to Ein Sof. Everything emerged from Ein Sof. So from up above here, here'd be nothing. And yet here was everything. Ein Sof is up here. The first thing to emerge was the crown of the first thing of God. So this is the pure glory of God. It's the first moment of God. For there to be anything, there must be intentionality. And that inner intentionality of God, the first stirring. I mean, this is a part of you. Have you ever woke up before their alarm? Did you get up before your alarm? The thing was unconscious to you. It wasn't like conscious. It's that something arose you to stir you into consciousness, before consciousness. Imagine this is the thing that gets up before God's alarm goes off, right? Keter is that thing. It's not conscious. It's not it's completely unknowable. You can have a thing that stirred you to get up 1 second before your alarm. Stirred into your primordial consciousness. And that first thing is Keter, and we can know nothing about it. Except for it must have happened. We can logically deduce it because things are here. Keter is completely unknowable. And as you can see here, right, at the top, it says I am, nothingness. Because it's a kind of knowable nothingness. Ein Sof is an unknowingness. Keter is a knowable nothingness. Now, in order to wake up, when you wake up, you immediately come into consciousness. But if you've ever had a sort of surprise wake up, consciousness happens to you like a flash. Everything's like, right? Oh, your Google Map, your Google timesheet shows up, your calendar and your emails and everything. It's like a flash of everything that you have to do for the day. That momentary flash that isn't even consciousness is chokhmah. It's pure, undiluted consciousness that's completely just a flash of everything that you know all at once. Now, obviously, you can't, because it's like everything that you know coming at you all at once is a gestalt. You have to parse things out. You have to analytically think, all right, now I have to get up, now I have to get the kids up, now I have to write this email, now I have to do this and do this and do this. Your consciousness has to be compartmented. That sounds like a real word. That amplification of God's consciousness is being. It's God's intelligence at some level, or God's understanding, right, as opposed to God's wisdom. The flash and then the analyticalization of that flash, and you can see how these happen immediately. They're not like long period drawn out. These are like logical deduction. We'll come back to God. Have chesed. Chesed is the immediate moment where, if you're doing things wrong, you know everything you have to do in the day. What is the thing you should do? Take care of yourself. First, take care of yourself. This is chesed. This is a part of you that's loving kindness, pure loving kindness. But if you stay in loving kindness, you're never going to get anything done. Love yourself all day. And how do you do that? You teach yourself. I got to get to work. I got to write this email. This email I feel bad. This guy's bothering me on the email. So what do you switch to now? Judgment. You have to move out of the world. That's the email I'm not going to respond to. I don't, who cares what he says? It's judgment. Judgment, when it's unchecked by chesed, that's evil. Just unchecked by any loving kindness, it can just be violent, vengeful rage. And in fact, in a couple of we'll see tonight, this is where evil comes from. Imagine a bowl flowing from Bina to Chesed, right? And then Chesed flows immediately to Gevurah. Imagine Gevurah flows out a little bit. Pure, unchecked judgment flows out. That pure, unchecked judgment that flows out of Gevurah. These upper spirit realms, the most beautiful thing imaginable. The balance between justice and mercy, between political law. You know how to judge, you know how to love, you know how to think, you know how to be. And Tiferet is the womb of creation. Everything becomes balanced in the womb of creation. From Tiferet, we have Netzach and Hod. Netzach and Hod are very strange little spheres that don't get enough attention, but I think they're very interesting. This is the fact that you have to persist. When you get perfectly balanced, I don't know about you, but we're going to the gym, you eat your goals, or you reach your intellectuals, or you reach whatever goals you have, and you want to. Netzach, growth, is the part of you that can go a little further than you think you can go. And then Hod is a part that's a little more inward, right? Because if you think you grow, you have nothing but blind ambition, well, then check it. What do you check it with? You turn inward. You become introverted. In many ways, Netzach is the principle of God's extrovertedness, and Hod is the principle of God's introvertedness. Those come together in Yesod. And Yesod is something like absolute divine unity, concentration. Everything comes together in Yesod, and this God processing. God is processing outward. There's outward momentum. Balanced, of course, right? Balance like this. It's balance between God's exuberance and God's superiority. I'm a very introverted Rabbi Rothschild. You may know as a very extroverted person. Imagine the two of us combined. We somehow have a very curly beard, more hair than I. Both these combined is Yesod. This is the phallus of the divine. But this is to it, all of the core vagina of the divine. And Yesod and Shekhinah fold in upon each other. We must think about this thing in like 3 dimensions. They fold upon in on one another. And into that folding flows out pure Shekhinah. And you can see here it's open at the bottom, almost like a womb, right? It's open at the bottom. And you are here. This is where our world is, a world of Malchut. Malchut is kingship. I think better, queenship. Because the Shekhinah is how we interact with God in this realm, in this part of in this part of reality. We only really approach God as Shekhinah, as the feminine form of God. And so here, this is the area of reception and expansion of God's power. Just as the womb grows to hold a child, God is expanding. This is the part of God that receives all of the other sphirot. And not only that, but God, everything that expands must contract. And so we are in the world of Malchut. We receive the law. This will be very, very important in a moment. We receive the Torah. What we do with the Torah, we become pregnant with the Torah. God, we catch this divine procession, and then by following, throw it back. Right? So it's not just that Malchut and Shekhinah are passive. The idea is not a Kabbalistic idea. It's not passive feminine that Shekhinah is. Shekhinah is also receiving, but very importantly, processing back up, recessing back up, and everything we do down here gets mirrored back up in the entire structure. This is the Kabbalistic solution for the problem we mentioned last time. How we bridge the infinite and the finite. We start from the infinite recess of Ein Sof, way up here above Keter, Shekhinah, and then Shekhinah bounces them all the way back up. And that procession and recession continues as long as it must continue until everything is balanced. It's achieving that balance. So not the obliteration of desire, it's not you being whatever, because it's not thought about as you. It's not about you. This text imagines the corporate Klal Yisrael doing this. So the thing here that's at work is the rebalancing of the structure of reality. That, to the Zohar's mind, when you read the Zohar, that's the goal. It's achieving metaphysical, cosmic, balance. So, this is the image you've seen. This is the image I'm sure you've seen of Sphirot. That is the 2-minute, 3-minute explanation of what's going on. This is never balanced. It's never balanced. That's right. Gevura would not live in a world in which there was suffering and violence. That's not to say that in the perfect there won't be some kind of violence. There might be all kinds of violence. It just might be that that balance is matched by because again, the writer of the Zohar doesn't imagine that in the perfect world the death penalty will go away. It just imagines it will properly. Because in Jewish law, which is the perfect example of law according to the Zohar, there are death penalty cases. There's 4 modes of the death penalty: behead, burn, stone, strangle to death. So the Zohar imagines that people will be executed even in a perfect world, but their execution will be just. It will be part of God being punished, being done correctly. So put your liberal woke. What's important is to imagine what it imagines a world. The Torah, the laws of Moses, revealed by God, are how this gets balanced out. We'll come back to that more in just a moment. Let's talk about the Shekinah. So small on this slide. I'm not sure why. Not the reason why. It's because my text on one slide. It's very simple. The word for Shekinah is actually coming from the word for to dwell or to settle. The Shekinah of God, the part of God, the aspect of God that settles amongst the world. It's a part of God that exists in our register of reality. And this idea has a couple of different historically important precursors that I just want to mention. The first is that you may know this, but you may not, that in the earliest instances of the discussion of Yahweh, Yahweh had a wife. There are really early images of Yahweh actually having a consort or a wife, and this being Asherah. The earliest depictions we have of Yahweh actually depict this being as having had a wife. And so early on in Israelite literature, there's always a very difficult relationship with the idea that God could have a feminine consort. And one way of dealing with that was to condemn everything dealing with the feminine aspect of God, especially Asherah, and punishing the worship of Asherah. You can do with that is sublimate that. Good old classic. What that means is that there are all aspects of God that sort of get divinized, particularly God's wisdom. Have you ever read the book of Proverbs? It's a long section where wisdom, almost a kind of feminine God, she's contrasting woman, Isha Zara. But there's an idea that wisdom can be personified and maybe even deified, and that idea is going to become hugely important in the Zohar later. Also, the idea that God has a kind of presence in the world that's distinct at some level from God. That God can be fire coming down the mountain, dwelling in the Mishkan, or a pillar of fire during the day. There is an idea that is of the reality of God. And what's happening by the time of the Babylonian Talmud is that this term for the presence of God is sometimes referred to as the Shekinah. This is the presence of God. While the noun here is woman, a feminine gendered, woman gendered entity, because they just think of it as a grammatically feminine noun, not as a woman. So as you might imagine, with Zohar, part of the Zohar is going to do is the Zohar and the Sefer Bahir are going to be mystical, not in that they read things in very elaborate, very obtuse ways. They'll do that too, but how they read things very literally. The text says the Shekhinah, it must be feminine. Full stop. It just is. It's not just a grammatical reality, it's an ontological reality. And what we'll see in the Talmud that it is the case that there often is, since one of the things that I know is that there are a couple of the Bible the rabbis were always very nervous about. One of those was Kohelet. And another one of those books the Bible was very concerned about was the Song of Songs, because it's about teenagers having sex, and that seems weird. So the rabbi said, look, it's not about teenagers having sex, it's about the relationship between God and Israel. Well, if God is the masculine, well, where does that leave Israel? Well, I should say, no, it's not Israel being feminine, it's another part of God. And so we have this idea developing over time. There could be an entire long series of lectures on the development of the Shekhinah, about 1,000 being a grammatical construct with an element of God living in the world to being an ontological metaphysical construct with actually God being feminine. So there's a lot of complicated things going on in that. Also, what's worth pointing out here, and I don't want to dwell on this too long, is that in the old Gnostic mythology, this is a mythology that developed really into texts like the Apocryphon of John and some other texts as well, and the Nag Hammadi library, and large, as you may remember, Jews that as a faith liberates you from this world. That if you knew certain kinds of things about this world, you could escape from it. That's, it's not knowledge saving you as opposed to faith saving you or belief saving you. It's the flow of God's self process. There's a disaster, and that very last rung is an entity called Sophia, wisdom, a very similar entity we find in the book of Proverbs. And Sophia wants to create something without reference to the world, and she's an abomination. This is called Yaldabaoth, which is probably Hebrew word chaos child. And the text really dreadful about that idea, but alive and not alive, it's ignorant, blind, chaotic, and it creates an entire world to mirror itself. Sanity, and that world is our world. Our world is the world of that evil entity creating. I mean, not to rehearse this too, is that there seems some good evidence to say that elements of that kind of mythology survived in Judaism a lot longer than it survived in Christianity. We see similar elements to that in the Sefer Bahir, where it describes wisdom, Chokhmah, as a maiden from a far-off land or a maiden from a foreign land cast into the world. So we think there may be connections all the way back to the late Gnostic worldview, which again, that term is a bit in a lot of ways, but we think that maybe of the two things. One is culture idealizing remote all the rage in troubadours. You have to sing all these praises to her, but you can never have her. This courtly literature is a huge part of Spanish literature, both at the literary level, but also at the troubadour level. And so there's an enormous outpouring of approachable woman. And so we have that happening at the literary level, at the musical level, at the popular level. That's also very important. Is at the same time that this is going on in the church world, the male cult in the Catholic world in Spain is also getting steam. The adoration of the Virgin Mary was not always a big deal in the same way that it is now. That really began in Spain, and the adoration of the Virgin Mary was very, very popular. And so there's some reason to believe that the adoration of the Virgin Mary, that the Shekhinah, that may have been a Jewish response or hegemonic culture. The Jewish response was, look, they're trying to convert a bunch of us, and what's really popular is this whole Virgin Mary thing. Well, we got that. We don't even see Virgin Mary. We got God. God's a woman. God does all this cool Virgin Mary does. And so, if you carefully, a lot of the stuff it says about looks a lot like the kind of stuff that the Marian cult, and I think mirroring in a very good way. They're hybridizing the Marian cult and developing a hybridized version of it. version lean on their tradition, but as a response to larger Spanish culture, but literarily, but also with the Marian cult. And we use the word cult here, not it's just we use the word religious studies. We use the word cult to indicate a very specific, acute kind of. That the Shekhinah becomes explicit feminine aspect of that. The Zohar, that it's no doubt that they're feminine God. That's the aspect of God that human beings deal with. And this diagram, there's all kinds of things that get associated with. What the writer of the Zohar does is something very interesting. When they want to find where the Shekinah is, they will rely on the fact that any time you see the word et in Hebrew, et, as you may know, for folks who know, et is a direct object marker in Hebrew. It's translated. So if you want to see it, for instance, at the very beginning of Genesis, I have the very first verse of, or part of the first verse of Genesis here, right? So he made, namely God, what? Et. Check my pronunciation to be correct. Academic Hebrew. Et. God created et. Now, to read this grammatically correctly, you would say, in the beginning, he created, who created? God, Elohim, gods. Et, direct object marker. What did God create? Hashemayim, God created the heavens, and further direct object marker, the earth. Because the Torah would never jump around. So here, Aleph Tav and Aleph Tav cannot just be superfluous. They can't just be random direct object markers. Direct object markers. What are they? It's the Shekinah. The world is this then Shekinah dwells on the earth, the Aretz. And so we have here, right, in the Aretz. So we have is reading, also an incredibly literalistic reading of the Bible, where a direct object marker is not just a direct object marker. It's the creation rather of into the heavens. And the about this. The Zohar is all about this because it means that Shekinah dwells in the heavens and she dwells, and that's in our world. Where notice she does not dwell in our world. Right? Elohim and certainly doesn't. This bara is creation with the subject created. It's just he creates. Or creates, you could say. What creates? Nothing. Right? In the beginning, nothing created. What did nothing? Was the throat, and then what from them? Shekinah, where Shekinah, Hashemayim, the Haaretz. For the Kabbalist, for the Zohar, they see the entire structure of the Sefirot echoed in the first words of the Bible. Again, not because they're reading things out of it that are unusual, but rather because they're reading it incredibly literally. So, what's fascinating about this is that, again, it shows you something about how the Zohar works in terms of basically lost on you. So, what's going to happen in all of this is that the world of Malchut is one with the supernal world and what is called unification. This is kind of a sacred marriage. And what's going to happen according to the world of the world is that the task of our world is to take the Shekhinah, which is in exile, this idea that God's presence in exile is found when Israel goes, is unify the Shekhinah, which is in Galut, in this world, this carnal world, and as we do that with the process of Jewish law, it's the case that we remarry, what's happened? The Zohar never says. And as we get later on to Lurianic Kabbalah, we'll learn why, according to at least Lurianic, why the primordial imbalance happened to the big drama about why it happened. We'll get to it next time. So what ends up happening here is that we are plunged into matter and we have to return back. What's different about, for instance, Kabbalah and maybe not text is that there's nothing wrong with matter. It just needs redeemed. Just like a coupon. There's nothing wrong with a coupon, but a coupon needs to get redeemed. And so the idea is that you redeem matter. Not that you restate it, not that you betray it, not that you get rid of it. Bad or evil, but it's in need of redemption. How does that redemption happen? It happens through this spiritual process of being reunified with the supernal world. Even what happened in the Garden of Eden, that really went awry, it's not really clear what went awry, is an indication, at least in some sections of the Torah, that what ended up happening was that Adam became so infatuated with the carnal world that Adam was actually pious. So notice this is a complete inversion of the Garden of Eden story. In the Garden of Eden story, it's that, in the original version, it's that human beings are too worldly, too sexual. In that version is that or whatever, they did some kind of thing, whatever it was, and that being focused too much on their bodies, but it messed them up. No, in the two figures of Shekhinah and his partner, Chava, life, physical world, feels abandoned by him. She's not by him. She's not being he's not doing it. That's what allows her to be seduced by the Nachash, by the snake. And so the traditional version is all the blame put on her. She gets tricked by the snake. Version, at least one version of the word version, is his fault. He's a negligent husband. And he's so focused on the supernal world that he focuses. The Zohar is very clear about this. You cannot focus just on a spiritual. You can't become a monk. There's no mystical, Kabbalistic monks. You are obliged to deal in this world, dealing in this world, that you can actually deal with the spiritual world. So again, how does this? Well, Moses eventually come. So combining the spiritual and the physical. Again, the Zohar is all about balance. Combine the spiritual and the physical, that we become the latter again. It's too much from the world of the supernal. Other patriarchs focus too much on the world of the terrestrial. And the idea is we must combine them. Religious observing a very hyper heteronormative way of thinking about this. Although I think at the edges of the text, there's a lot of interesting homoeroticism of queering. The Zohar ideas it commits to don't conform to that. It can't logically. So they're doing all kinds of cool studies. Those categories break down pretty rapidly when you get a little bit going on. And the Zohar ultimately is that there's a kind of sacred marriage with Israel and the Shekinah and Israel with the Sephirot and body on the Jewish law as a kind of because the Jews have a covenant with God, a marriage contract. The only similar thing to that is sex. It's only by having a certain kind of relationship with a certain kind of person that you can have sex with them. Well, because the Israel have this relationship, then it these 613 rules kind of intercourse with the divine. And so it's thought of incredibly in erotic terms. And so this is very much linked to things like Shabbat. As we'll see next time, Shabbat becomes incredibly linked, and Kabbalah is really core observance. In fact, if you've ever done Kabbalah Shabbat, which I imagine most people in this class have, Kabbalah Shabbat is a completely invented service by 16th century Kabbalists to reintegrate between God and Israel every single day. That's the reason why you sing it. It's because you get married every week to the Shabbat bride. And that idea comes directly back to Zohar, and it's become ingrained in systems that it's now a service that basically, I would say even liberal Jews on Friday nights that are something understood here in the Kabbalah. It's probably dig at the Catholics. One of the things that Judaism did have going for it, that Catholicism didn't, is that Catholicism really, I don't know if you know this, people, they like sex. People love sex. It's a big thing. They like it. They get down on it. People pay for it. People sell it. It's a big part of the internet. It may be the reason why the internet exists, basically. We may just be piggybacking on like video games and sex. So I think that's actually true. It's probably we piggyback on military intelligence, Pornhub, and same thing too. So anyway, it's very much the case that part of this whole attitude towards sex is very hyper heteronormative and very much in the marriage environment. But it's also the case that this is probably a dig at Christianity, because Christianity is all about priestly celibacy. It's all about the perpetual virginity of Mary, and it's all about the fact that Jesus and Paul were never married, and I suppose never had sex. And the Jews at the time, the rabbis at the time, are like, yeah, that sucks. Sucks for them. They gotta be celibate. Mary never got to have sex, or at least she only had sex with God, kinda, or whatever. And Jesus and Paul never got married, never had sex. Like, they're even the average rabbi down the street doing a lot gets laid at least once a week, and your God never got pity for your God, which will stop dating. I think it's a dig at, I think it's a dig at their relationship to the physical body at some level. It's about maintaining your Jewish community by saying, yeah, have sex. In fact, you're obligated to have sex. You've got to have sex. But know that your sex is part of this mystical thing, and it's very carefully constrained. Right? So those things are also true as well. Now, if there's good stuff, like sex, there's also bad stuff. Of course, that's evil. And evil, in the Kabbalah, is thought of as part of God. This is called the Sitra Achra, the other side. Now, what we know about the Jewish world and the Christian world is evil is about privation. But evil was something like a lack of heat. Darkness is just a lack of light. Darkness is nothing on its own. Cold is nothing on its own. And so, because these things are just else, they don't really exist. So, evil is just a non-existent place where God is. It's just that rebels against God. It's part of your heart, according to Augustine, that rebels against God, and that emptiness inside your God-shaped hole, that's evil. And because Satan is just a pure rebellion, Satan's just pure negation. Well, this is true of Neoplatonism, it's true of lots of different traditions within Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. The rabbis of the Kabbalah, especially in the Castilian Kabbalah, Zohar, say, no, evil's real. And it's not hard to imagine why medieval could be very, very consistent with the reality of evil. Evil was part of their world. I mean, they didn't face pollution the way they did in Germany. The reality of the Reconquista, no, that once they were done with the Muslims, evil was real. So we're not going to have this philosophical or crap. We're not going to have this idea that evil's not real. Evil's real, and if evil's real, it must come from God, because everything comes from God. Everything flows from Ein Sof. So where does it come from? Well, we'll think back to this image, and we talked about this a minute ago. So Keter flows into Chokhmah. Chokhmah flows into Binah. And again, you can imagine water rush over. It's caught by, and as it rushes back over to Binah, it's caught by Binah. It's caught by Chesed, but it's so much power flowing now, and it's like a bowl for water into it. Some of it run for it's like in the famed image of the Zohar. There's an image of Zohar I love better than any other one. Is the image of the blacksmith anvil. Forge an item in a blacksmithery, metal. And the only way you're going to get a form for an item, you have to pound that metal. There's no way you can shape the unformed metal without pounding. And as you pound, sparks fly off, shards of metal fly off, drops. And it's an inevitable part of creating something. When you do something, it throws off sparks. And those sparks are burning and dangerous, and they're dross, they're wreckage. In the Zohar, that wreckage, that dross, those sparks, that excess of pure gevurah, pure rage, righteous rage, you can imagine what ends up happening is that it flows out of gevurah, the entire backside of all of the other sefirot, like a kind of evil coating, a darkness, a kind of hatred, a rage, an inversion of each one of these. As it coats the backside of them, that forms another reality. And that other reality is the world of the Sitra Achra, the other side. These are like inverted, evil, negative image sefirot. So horrifying. The first three don't even. They're so absolutely evil that the will of God destroys them, that they are annihilated. They can't even exist at all. They implode in their own absolute negativity, like a black hole or something. But the other seven, right? So the first three implode and vanish. The last seven, they continue to exist. Oh, I should say this about Binah, or about Da'at. Sorry. In some schemes of this, you may see another sefirah here, another sefirah right here. It's called Da'at. It means knowledge. The reason why there might be another sefirah here is because Keter, because it's so not a thing, they don't count it as real. You need something else to make the 10 up, and Da'at becomes a kind of pseudo sefirah. It gets really complicated. We go for the purpose of this class, but it ends up being a balance between the completely nothingness of Keter, of Chokhmah and Binah, and the balance of these three, just like these are balanced here, these four are balanced in Tiferet, you get a balancer here and Da'at. But often you'll see it drawn with sort of like a dot circle to be Da'at. If you have questions about that, we can get to that later in the Q&A. At any rate, that dross is thrown off, and that becomes evil. For the Zohar, evil's real. It's a necessary aspect of reality, and you can't get rid of it by anything other than refining it. You can't get rid of it except for by refining it. You have to subject it to purification. And how does one purify it? One purifies it by the process of Ol Siyas Tikkun and Molach. Now, as we get to later on, what's important to know about this, and we're going to go a little bit over, but I think we'll get a lot of the stuff. So it's inherently bad. Imagine it as an excess of something that has to be tempered. And you temper it by rectifying it, by by fixing it. And in the later Lurianic Kabbalah, we'll get to this later on, this becomes the shards of the klipot, these demonic entities, demonic angels almost, that rule the world of darkness. And that world of darkness can creep into our world. And one of the lines in the book of Genesis that the Zohar really harps on in this is it talks about the 7 Edomite kings that died. And this is a throwaway line, I think Genesis 22 or something, that it seems like that these lines don't have anything to do with anything. There's a bunch of Edomite kings that died. Oh, not for the Zohar. They're the primordial evil worlds that exist. And you have to deal with them. And you have to deal with them by rectifying them. And the thing that the Zohar is the most worried about, the thing that it harps on the most, more than I think anything else, is the same kind of thing the Catholics harp on. And that's masturbation. My God, Zohar is horrified of sexual sins, especially masturbation. And there's the idea that if one wastes seed, then that seed, the spent semen that's sort of lying there, becomes demons. It just becomes like more and more demons. The world gets more balanced and more tilted to the other side. Also, the uncleanliness of so-called uncleanliness of menstruation. This is a deeply horrifying world. In fact, so much so that because of the primordial sin of Eve, she is the sort of representative of evil in the world, because her menstrual blood is like a dross thrown off by her menstrual cycle. And the menstrual blood is just like the dross thrown out in the process of creation, where creation sort of didn't occur, baby wasn't born. Again, this is all super problematic in lots of ways. But the idea is the blood flowing out of her mirrors the dross thrown off in the process of creation, sort of not creating this. And there's a ton of interest in evil. The Zohar bounds and discussions of evil, and it's probably leaning very on discussions of even evil we found in earlier Kabbalists. Steele, from the Cohen brothers, they were very interested in evil. They were treated as an emanation of the inside. And so there are tons and tons of things about evil, especially anti-Gentile stuff. So we have to be very honest. The Zohar hates Gentiles. Overwhelmingly thinks Gentiles are corrupt, evil, and dangerous and bad. This is not an ecumenical text. At any stretch of the imagination, you could not read this text and imagine this text has anything good to say about them. And so, again, are you not surprised? Again, imagine positive interactions with non-Jewish people, Christians. Not really. It's so surprising I have a pretty negative attitude when it comes to non-Jewish people. Now, does that mean that the Zohar is inherently bigoted? It might. It might mean that it's a bigoted text, especially if you take those same attitudes and apply them to non-Jewish people now. Yeah, it's going to result in you being real bigoted, mystically bigoted, probably the worst form of bigotry. So we have to own the fact that stuff is in there and deal with it as Jews. If you want to study the Zohar and stuff, you have to understand the bigoted things against non-Jewish people there, and you have to deal with them in whatever way you think it's fit to deal with them. And they can lean on that because the historical character of Shimon Bar Yochai himself was heavily impressed by the Romans and the Roman colonial project in Judea. And also Shimon Bar Yochai says some of the most shockingly anti-Jewish, anti-Gentile stuff you can find in the entire Talmud. I think he says once that the only thing that Gentiles and snakes share the same thing in common. They're both better without heads. That stuff is terrible. For those of us who non-Jewish people are a huge part of our life, that stuff is unconscionable. It's there. It's in the Talmud. It's in the Zohar. And we have to deal with it. We shouldn't ignore it. It's there. Now, can anti-Semites pick up on that stuff and claim that the Talmud is racist and hates Gentile people, and they can do the same thing about the Zohar? They don't know the Zohar very well, so they won't do that. But it's there too. Just so you anti-Semites know, you can also attack us with the Zohar too. They don't know that because they don't take the time to actually read this stuff. The demonology of the Zohar is very complex. You have numerous stories of demons in the Zohar, and that's not surprising because you have the exact demonological stories flourishing in Christianity at the time. This is the exact time there's a rapid rise in demonology in the Christian world as well. And so, again, unsurprisingly, Jewish and Christian demonologies are sort of developing at pace with one another at this time period. And eventually this will give rise to the concept of the Dybbuk. And we'll get to the Dybbuk in a little while when we concepts of possession, exorcism, and Judaism that began to emerge primarily in the late 16th century. So the Dybbuk, you heard of the idea of the Dybbuk, it's going to emerge primarily, at least regionally, at some point. And they said, last thing for the night. What's really important about the Zohar is that it's an incredibly conservative text, which is to say it wants to defend rabbinic tradition, very wed tradition. There's no interest in fucking rabbinical tradition. Now it interprets things in rabbinical tradition in very exotic and very avant-garde ways, but it's very worried about philosophers. Because philosophers are the most dangerous people in the world, y'all. I don't know if you know about us, but we're dangerous people. That's why they kill us from time to time. And one of the things that worried the writers of the Zohar is that the Jewish philosophers at the time, argued that basically all the weird stuff in the Torah is just symbolism. It's just metaphor. And really, God is really concerned about you being reasonable, being rational, person. And if you understand the Bible in more terms than that, you're probably engaging in some kind of stupid idolatry. Because you just don't know better, you're not really trained as a philosopher. The danger with that, folks, is that Jews are facing an overwhelming pressure to convert beginning at this time in the 13th century. Very strong pressure to convert. They can be given land and title and deeds. They can be given all kinds of encouragement to convert. Conversion is very, very attractive. And again, forget, we're 190 years out, 200 years out from the Alhambra decree in 1492. The pressure is already on for Jews to convert. As you can imagine, a wealthy Jewish doctor, wealthy Jewish poet, wealthy Jewish, rabbi, who's having a lot of pressure to convert, if he's a Maimonidean and believes that really God's a kind of metaphor and the Jewish law is a kind of metaphor, angels are kind of metaphors, why the hell are you going to stick your neck out for a bunch of metaphors? If Jesus and God and Moses and they all kind of come out the same in the wash job, land, you best believe those people, they converted not because they hated their religion, but because they were educated enough, or perhaps too much, that they can say, look, I can still worship my God inwardly, I can still believe in all the things I believe in, and I can pray in church. Because praying in church gets me a deal, gets me a title. So why not convert? The Zohar says, because you mess up all the reality. That's why. You stupid, dangerous, bad Jew. Why? Because the very way that the very way that God engineered reality was that you reverse engineer it and correct it by following the Torah. You have to understand what are called the mitzvot, are the reasons for commandments. The commandments in the Torah are not random. They're not made up things. When God says put the felon on, when God says where it sits this, when God says honor the Sabbath on this day and not Sunday, when God says do this and do this, God's not telling you random things. God's telling you that this is a roadmap for not just a roadmap for piety, but a roadmap for the reconstruction of reality. This is how you fix the world. And not only that, God's telling you not just to follow these rules because you should follow them. God's telling you to follow the rules because God follows them. God kept Shabbat. God puts on the felon. God puts on a talith. God does everything that you're supposed to do. This is imitatio Dei. The task is not for you to do a bunch of rules. The task is for you to follow the rules because God does those rules. And insofar as God does those rules and you do those rules, you are co-creators of the perfect world. And it's only by doing that, it's only by following the Jewish law scrupulously, especially the rules that make no sense. It's only by following those rules that seem to make no sense that you have any chance at all of balancing out the world of Sefirot. The only way you can do this, the only way that the world will be fixed, is by Jews being observant Jews. So, again, to drive this point home, the Kabbalah is not liberal, hippy-dippy Judaism. The Kabbalah is the most radically, legally conservative Judaism you can imagine. And why? Because the esoteric meaning of the mitzvot is that they are actually part of a reconstruction, recreation, renovation of the world. The renovation of the world, the tikkun olam, the reparation of the world. And it's only by following the Jewish law as scrupulously as possible, especially the parts of it that don't make any sense, is that accomplishable. So, in the same way that God created the world and God mandated the various holidays, the mandating of those holidays is not just you doing things, such as Rosh Hashanah or before Pesach. These are divinely mandated temporal structures in which one can correct the world at a very specific way at a very specific time, but you can't correct the world any other day of the year. You have special powers that day, right? And you have to correct the world. And the Zohar loves, for instance, very minor holidays. Sometimes you travel to Israel, they'll ask you what a Jewish holiday is. They're trying to weed out, I don't know, rabble-rousers. Right? They're trying to weed out people. Well, I've always wanted to visit them, right, and say, yeah, my favorite holiday is Shemini Atzeres. Shemini Atzeres, the most obscure holiday ever. But the Zohar says Shemini Atzeres is the most important holiday in the world to come. There'll be no more important holiday. Yom Kippur will be a joke. But Shemini Atzeres is a completely obscure holiday, right at the very end of the Chag. I hope that's what's really important, because that's what's going to be important in the world to come, right? So all of the holidays get these heavily mystical meanings. Counting of the Omer, something that seems completely ridiculous. You're counting down the days to bring a piece of grain to the thing that we don't even do anymore? Oh yeah. Counting of the Omer is incredibly important. Because you're not just counting down the Omer, you're counting down to the reception of the Torah. So you can replay the entire process again. So everything becomes heavily imbued. If you've ever stayed up late on Shavuot, if you've ever done a tikkun on Shavuot, stayed up late on Shavuot studying, well, you've done something Kabbalistic. Why? Because the entire process, right, is by receiving the Torah again. You have to be a Bona to receive it again. And so you get a completely cyclical period of time. The Zohar is imagining that cycle gets you, and it spirals up, right? You start from here, cycle, until eventually we reach the world of the divine. And it's through the process of rectification of the divine, tikkun olam, that the world's redeemed. Now this gets liberalized in our modern conception, right? It means like be a good person and do nice things, and you make the world a better place. The Kabbalists do not imagine it as like make this world a better place. It's the idea that you're renovating this world metaphysically, ontologically, cosmologically. And so that idea is found deeply in the Sefer Zohar. Zohar, these are big things. If you were to read the Zohar, study the Zohar, you would see these things over and over and over again. It's like again, it's like jazz. They're gonna take these things and play them over and over again. Oh, the things there are the minor things that are important. These are the big ones. And Sof, the Sefirot, the Shekhinah, balancing of the Sefirot, the idea of the Sitra Achra, the theory of evil, and the idea of the Torah and Mitzvot. These are the big things that dominate the literary text that is the Sefer Zohar. Last week, how this thing became scripture. How did anyone believe this was true? This book just appeared, and people were like, yeah, that's it. That's the roadmap for the recreation of all being. It's this book in the hands of this dude in Spain. So people were skeptical, and we'll talk about how this became scripture, how this went from being a weird collection of texts in the late 13th century of Spain to becoming basically the cornerstone of Jewish theology. I'm pretty sure if you've ever heard any aspect of Jewish theology, it's been something coming out of the Sefer Zohar. So we're going to do next time, we're going to think of how the Sefer Zohar was received, and we're going to begin discussing Lurianic Kabbalah. Because one of the Kabbalah is going to do is it's going to be part of the systematization of the Zohar. The Zohar is not a systematic text by any stretch of the imagination. It is it's very difficult. It's not systematic. And so what ends up happening is people begin systematizing it. And you have a couple different generations of systematizers, and what ends up happening is that the definitive systematizer is going to be Luria through his student, Chaim Vital. So we'll talk about that process of systematization, that process of canonization, and why it became decanonized next time, so as we transition into what I would call the Zohar and its vicissitudes. On for. Welcome. Welcome back, and thank you for joining me as I explore the garden that is Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. Again, if you'd like to support my work of providing accessible, free, and scholarly content on topics like Kabbalah, alchemy, and the occult, along with magic, hermetic philosophy, consider supporting my work on Patreon, or perhaps with a one-time donation. You can find those links below. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.
You're fine.
My life.